Today we start on chapter 16, the endocrine system. So our first module, 16.1, the overview of the endocrine system. The endocrine system works by secreting hormones. These hormones interact with specific target cells because target cells have the correct shaped receptor. So hormones fold up to have a very specific shape, and then the receptor, which they're going to bind to, is complementary to that shape. So not all hormones can interact with all cells throughout the human body. So that's how the hormones know which cells that they are going to be able to create changes in, is because of these receptors. Most all hormones in the human body are regulated by negative feedback loops. We're already familiar with that. So as the level of a hormone starts to decrease in the human body, an endocrine gland will take action, ramp up production of hormones, and release more into the bloodstream. Now, both the nervous system and the endocrine systems provide communication within the human body, but they are complementary to each other. The nervous system provides very quick results. So the nervous system utilizes action potentials, nerve impulses, neurotransmitters, and it's almost an instantaneous type of result because nerve impulses are so fast. The endocrine system varies. When an endocrine gland releases a hormone, that hormone can take effect within a matter of seconds, minutes, or days. There's not very many hormones that can take effect within seconds. Epinephrine is probably the only one that I can think of. Most of your hormones are going to take minutes or days. For instance, when you release insulin, insulin will take effect in minutes and allow your body cells to start to uptake blood glucose. Days, you might be looking at estrogen and testosterone. The effects of those two hormones are going to be fairly slow, but they are long sustaining type hormones. The effects of hormones are very broad. So some hormones stimulate the secretion from endocrine or exocrine cells. For instance, when we release gastrin, which is a hormone which targets the stomach, it's going to trigger the production of gastric juice from the exocrine cells. Another action would be activating or inhibiting enzymes whenever we release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone then stimulates cells to make enzymes which are used in the production of ATP. Some hormones stimulate or inhibit mitosis and or meiosis. For instance, when we release growth hormone is going to be very important in stimulating protein synthesis and mitotic divisions, whereas meiosis is going to be stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone. Opening or closing ion channels in the cell's plasma membrane and are altering its membrane potential. When we release epinephrine and norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system, that's going to cause the opening of calcium channels in the cardiac cells, allowing the heart to beat with more contractility. Activating or inhibiting transcription of genes that code for RNA or proteins. Obviously, growth hormone does that as it triggers growth. Another example of that would be estrogen. Estrogen triggers the regrowth of the endometrial lining after a woman has gone through menses. All right, I just wanted to point out, I want you to remember, how do hormones travel within the human body? Hormones travel through the bloodstream. So here's our endocrine gland. The endocrine gland is going to produce a hormone. That hormone is then secreted into the interstitial fluid and picked up by the capillaries of the blood vascular system. That hormone is then transported via the blood vascular system to its target cell. And how is it going to know what its target cell is? By the specific shape of the receptor on the target cell. So hormones use the blood vascular system as their conduit to travel throughout the body. This is information that you covered in anatomy, but I wanted to do a quick review of the organs involved in the endocrine system. Starting here in the brain. So what are the main organs found in the brain, which are endocrine organs? We have the hypothalamus, right here below the thalamus, and underneath the hypothalamus is the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. So most of the time the hypothalamus is going to releasing or inhibiting hormones, which is then going to dictate the release of hormones from your anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. On the back side of the thalamus is the pineal gland. We're not going to talk much more about that. We know that it makes melatonin, and that helps us with our sleep-wake cycles. As we head down from the head, at the base of the neck is a butterfly-shaped gland called the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland, of course, releases thyroid hormone, which helps us make ATP. If we flip the thyroid gland around and look on the back side, there are 4 little glands embedded on the back side called parathyroid glands. They are the most important glands for helping to regulate calcium levels in the human body. We keep moving down. Right above the heart is your thymus gland. We're going to talk about the thymus gland when we get to the lymphatic chapter and talk about the immune system, because the hormones released from the thymus gland are very important at helping to regulate the development of your specific immune system. Keep heading down here on top of the kidneys. We've got 2 glands called the adrenal glands. Now the adrenal glands have 2 parts. The outside of the adrenal glands is called the adrenal cortex. They're going to have a specific group of hormones that is produced, and just like the brain, if you remember the outside of the brain is the cortex, that's how you can remember the outside of the adrenal gland as the cortex. And then the inside is the adrenal medulla. We'll talk about that when we talk about the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. In between the kidneys, right below the stomach, is the pancreas. Pancreas is going to be secreting insulin and glucagon to help regulate blood glucose levels. And then the last 2, which we've already covered in the reproductive chapter, include the ovaries for the female, which make estrogen and progesterone and inhibin, and then the testes for the male, which make inhibin and also makes testosterone. Okay, we have 2 classes of hormones, and they're classified based upon chemical structure. So the first class is amino acid-based hormones. Now when we went through the biomolecules lab, we evaluated an amino acid, and we determined that in general, amino acids have polar covalent bonds, at least a greater share of them. So that makes them soluble in water. So our amino acid hormones are generally hydrophilic. They get along well with water. But since they can't cross the plasma membrane by diffusion, where are you going to find the receptors? They have to bind to plasma membrane receptors. So they can't get inside of the cell. So their receptor is on the outside of the plasma membrane. They are transported freely in blood because they get along with the plasma just fine, and in general they have a shorter half-life than the other class of hormones, which are called steroid hormones. So all steroid hormones derive from cholesterol, a lipid product. That makes them hydrophobic. They do not get along well with water. So these can cross the plasma membrane by diffusion, and they're going to bind to receptors which are inside of the cell, either in the cytosol or the nucleus. Do you remember when we talked about blood? You had transport proteins present in the plasma. So transport proteins are going to be necessary to transport steroid hormones throughout the body. And because they are bound to a transport protein, they do have a longer half-life. In other words, they're active for a longer period of time in the bloodstream than what most of the amino acid hormones are. All right, this is just a quick picture to remind you. Remember our phospholipid membrane? It's those lipid tails which have they act as a barrier for the crossing of anything that has polar covalent or ionic charge to it. So our hydrophilic hormones cannot cross the plasma membrane. So you're going to find the receptor for an amino acid-based hormone here on the outside of the plasma membrane, whereas our hydrophobic steroid hormones, they get along just fine with these phospholipid tails. They move through the plasma membrane through the process of diffusion, and they're going to find their receptors intracellularly, either in the cytosol or in the nucleus. All right, your hydrophilic hormones are an example of what's called a second messenger system. So hormones create metabolic changes within cells, whether it's amino acid based or steroid. They're going to create metabolic changes in the cell. Now, if you're a water-soluble hormone, you can't get directly into the cell to create these metabolic changes. Your receptor is going to be on the outside. So you're going to have somebody else on the inside of the cell delivering the message for you. That's why we call our amino acid-based hormones, we call these types of second messenger systems because they have to have another molecule do their job for them inside of the cell. There is a certain set of processes which must occur for hormones to create metabolic changes. The first step for a hydrophilic hormone to create changes inside of a cell is that hydrophilic hormone first binds to a receptor in the plasma membrane, and we call the hormone the first messenger. After that, we're going to activate G protein. G protein activates adenylate cyclase, and you notice that this is an enzyme which can be used again and again and again. Adenylate cyclase is then going to catalyze a chemical reaction. It's going to make cyclic AMP, adenosine monophosphate, and it's going to make that from ATP. Your CAMP, as it's called, is the second messenger. So what's your first messenger? The hydrophilic hormone, and what's going to carry out its job inside the cell? The second messenger, CAMP. All right, what's our last step? Your cyclic AMP activates protein kinases. Once again, another type of enzyme which catalyzes chemical reactions. What's it going to do? It's going to cause phosphorylation of other proteins, which will then cause the metabolic changes within the cell. So these are the 5 steps which any type of hydrophilic hormone is going to go through to make metabolic changes inside of the cell. Now, in this particular case, we are using CAMP as our example, but be aware that there are second messenger systems which utilize calcium as a second messenger also. They all work generally the same way. All right, here's our picture. I wanted to walk you through the 5 steps. So, first step, our first messenger, the hormone, binds to a receptor embedded in the plasma membrane because this is a water-soluble or a hydrophilic hormone made out of amino acids. Cannot cross the plasma membrane, so it finds the receptor in the plasma membrane. Once it binds to it, that's going to activate G protein on the inside of the cell. G protein will then activate adenylate cyclase, which is going to be an enzyme, catalyzes the conversion of ATP to our second messenger, CAMP. So cyclic AMP is going to go ahead and activate your protein kinases. So it can be used multiple times, and it activates many protein kinases. And since they are also a type of enzyme, what do? They phosphorylate or donate this phosphate group from CAMP, and that is then going to provide the energy for our phosphorylated proteins to create metabolic changes inside of the cell. Now notice this is very broad base. It doesn't give you any specifics. It's just trying to get across to you the steps that are necessary for a water-soluble hormone to create metabolic changes. The other thing which I want to point out to you is how many hormones are we talking about here to start with? Only one. And then how many activated phosphorylated proteins do we have down here? We have many. So does it take a whole lot of hormone to create some major changes inside of your cell? No. Hormones are very, very, very powerful, and a small amount of hormone can create big changes inside the human body. All right, here is a video from A&P Flicks to show you the mechanisms.
The endocrine system consists of hormone-producing tissues located throughout the body. The circulating hormones control the rates of body processes and maintain homeostasis. Within an endocrine gland, endocrine cells secrete hormones, which diffuse into nearby capillaries. The cardiovascular system transports these hormones throughout the body, affecting target cells in various tissues. Target cells for a specific hormone have receptors that bind the unique three-dimensional shape of that hormone. Cells that lack a specific hormone receptor are unresponsive to that hormone, even if a high concentration of the hormone is present around the cells. Although cells express a variety of receptors, we'll focus on one particular class: receptors that bind water-soluble hormones and exert their effects through the intracellular second messenger, cyclic AMP. These receptors are embedded in the cell's plasma membrane because water-soluble hormones cannot enter the target cell directly. A hormone molecule, acting as the first messenger, binds to its receptor, causing the receptor to change shape. The receptor can now activate specific intracellular G proteins. The activation process begins with the release of a GDP molecule from the G protein in exchange for a GTP molecule. This causes the G protein to change shape and become active. The hormone-bound receptor activates many individual G proteins, which greatly amplifies the signal from a single hormone molecule. An activated G protein diffuses along the plasma membrane until it binds to and activates the enzyme adenylate cyclase. Once active, adenylate cyclase converts ATP to the second messenger, cyclic AMP. These many molecules of cyclic AMP from each activated cyclase enzyme represent a further amplification of the initial hormone signal. The increased concentration of cyclic AMP activates enzymes known as protein kinases. These activated protein kinases phosphorylate a variety of proteins within the cell. This changes the activity of those proteins and generates the cell's hormone response. The cell's response is characterized by the specific proteins present in the cytoplasm, only some of which can be phosphorylated by protein kinase. The cellular response diminishes rapidly once the hormone is no longer bound to its receptor. G proteins hydrolyze their bound GTP to GDP, returning to their inactive state, and dissociate from adenylate cyclase. This ends cyclic AMP production. Existing cyclic AMP is degraded by the enzyme phosphodiesterase, which is already present in the cytoplasm. As the cyclic AMP concentration returns to resting levels, protein kinase inactivates, preventing further protein phosphorylation. The target cell has now returned to its pre-stimulus condition, ready to respond to future hormone signals. The signal of a water-soluble hormone binding to a receptor on the plasma membrane is amplified through the activation of many G proteins and the generation of even more cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP activates many protein kinases, which affect many thousands of intracellular proteins, all shaping the target cell's response. The response of many target cells produces the homeostatic and regulatory effects controlled by the endocrine system.
I am very grateful to have that video to show you that process because I think that will help you imagine what's going on the inside of your cells. All right, now how does that compare to hydrophobic hormones? So whereas your hydrophilic is a second messenger system, your hydrophobic hormones play a part in direct gene activation. So that word should tell you already what's going to happen. Where do we find the genes? Inside the nucleus. And hydrophobic hormones can cross the plasma membrane. So what are the steps by which hydrophobic hormones create metabolic changes inside the human body? The first step, the hormone crosses the plasma membrane and binds to receptors in the cytosol or nucleus. Second of all, the receptor hormone complex is then going to bind or interact with DNA. Now, what does DNA code for? The production of proteins. So that complex can alter protein synthesis by stimulating transcription. And we've learned about transcription. Transcription is when DNA, or the information contained in a gene, is copied into a strand of messenger RNA. Then that messenger RNA is going to leave the nucleus, go out to the cytoplasm, find a ribosome, and produce a protein by a process called translation. And these newly formed proteins are what change the metabolism of the cell. So these are the 5 steps which are required for a hydrophobic hormone to create metabolic changes. So in this case, your hydrophobic or your lipid-soluble hormone diffuses through the plasma membrane, binds to the DNA eventually, and triggers the creation of a new protein. All right, I'll walk you through the picture real quick. I don't have as nice of a video for this one. Hydrophobic hormones, so those are going to have non-polar covalent bonds. They're going to diffuse right through the phospholipid membrane, and they're going to find a receptor, and that receptor can either be in the cytoplasm or it could be found here in the nucleus. Once it binds with the receptor, it's called a receptor hormone complex. And that complex will migrate into the nucleus and bind to a specific region of DNA where it triggers transcription and translation, and the end product of translation, which would occur out here in the cytosol, is going to be a newly formed protein which creates the metabolic changes inside of the cell. So this is called direct gene activation. You can see how this is very different than the second messenger system used by hydrophilic hormones. All right, review questions for Module 16.1. Compare the nervous system with the endocrine system. Both systems are responsible for communication in the body. The nervous system provides almost instantaneous communication with the help of nerve impulses and neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system is going to release hormones, chemical messengers called hormones, which can have impacts which happen within the matter of seconds, minutes, or days, with the most common being impacts which last minutes or days. Number 2, how does a hormone travel to a target cell? Hormones are secreted into the interstitial fluid and are transported throughout the body via the blood vascular system. So they travel through your blood vessels. Number 3, what structure identifies a target cell? A target cell for a hormone has a specific receptor with the same or with a shape that complements the shape of the hormone. And number 4, compare and contrast the mechanism of action employed by water-soluble and lipid-soluble hormones to create metabolic changes in the cells. So I'm not going to go through all the details. You've got the 5 steps of each type of hormone listed before you. Just be aware, if you have a hydrophilic or an amino acid based hormone, where are you going to find the receptor for that hormone? It's going to be embedded in the plasma membrane, and then we have to have a second messenger to create the metabolic changes on the inside of the cell. And that second messenger, the example that we used here was cyclic AMP, which ended up activating or having proteins inside of the cytoplasm phosphorylated by protein kinases. Lipid-soluble hormones diffuse directly through the plasma membrane, finding their receptors in the nucleus or the cytosol, and they're going to trigger transcription and translation. Final product are going to be new proteins which alter the metabolism of the cell.